And so on that note, now I can kind of even talk about anthroposophy because it all ties into this. So anthroposophy was something that really started during the early 1900s, and it kind of sprouted out of theosophy. And I don't want people to get confused, because theosophy is one thing, and that was very misconstrued at the time, and that was done by Madame Blavatsky and even Aleister Crowley, and they were very into kind of those occult and darker practices from the Eastern way of thinking and philosophies. But anthroposophy is something else. But it also takes into those considerations of the ancient teachings of other religions, all these things, and it takes into the consideration of Christ as a focal point, still as what, but looking at more analytically, more as a matter of fact, this is what happened. Not so much just tied to the Catholic Church and their way of thinking of it, but tied into how supposedly, and it's controversial to talk about because it does go against the mainstream view of Christ and what happened. But supposedly the Christ body, the incarnation of the Christ being was what happened, and supposedly had that even Buddha from the past. There's different levels of that, of the Bodhisattva or whatever layers to that, and then that was like 500 or some years before Christ, but that being somehow also was incarnated into Christ at that time. So there was other levels of energy, or however you want to say, or beings that influenced that being, that person that existed. That was a physical form, but there was this other form that came in as well, and it was Christ incarnate and whatnot. I won't go delve too much more about that, but you have to think outside of the physical plane and outside of our physical bodies, that we do have an astral body and we do have an etheric body. And like, these are all part of what makes us whole as a human spiritual being, as a mind, body, spirit complex, as the law of one says, right? So those are things you really have to take into consideration. And he opposed, supposedly Rudolf Steiner, who was kind of the founder of this, had access to the Akashic record. And I want you to just know about Rudolf Steiner a little bit. And I think he's controversial in himself because of what he says. And there's lots of mainstream people that could probably, dismiss his what he has to say and discredit him however they want. But by looking at the actual material that he says and what he, like, don't always look at the messenger, look at the actual what he's actually saying. And it can really open your eyes to a whole nother world. So I didn't know anything about this philosophy or way of thinking until much later. And I think for good reason, because it's a lot to take in early on. And if you're very more analytical, critical thinking, you want science-based type of information. When you start talking about the Christ and things like that, it's hard to take that as fact. And especially when you say the Akashic record is, you're getting channeled information in a way. But what people don't realize also, or that that don't know about Rudolf Steiner, he is actually much more of a scientist in his early years. He was hanging out with the Albert Einsteins and the Niels Bohr, like the people that were doing these theoretical physics and quantum physics. Like, he was in that group. He was that brilliant of a mind, and he worked in that capacity in academia. But guess what? He didn't talk about any of the stuff that he talked about later tied with spirituality, because he wouldn't be accepted, right? So it wasn't until later in his life where he finally said, okay, I'm going to let people know, like, really, this is who I am. This is the information I have, not just, he touched on about every subject you could think of and had a way of breaking it down in a philosophical manner and actually being quite relevant for the times, which was during World War I, but also being quite prophetic as to what's happening right now. It's amazing. I've read some of these books that really tie into what's happening, how we think, even economics, politically, like all the strategies behind, people in power and what their real intentions are. And if they're not, really looking out for the greater good, but looking out for themselves. I mean, there's all those types of ethics and ideas of in philosophy itself that you can look at in anthroposophy. I was just going to say one of the most eye-opening books I've read recently was called The Incarnation of Ahriman on Earth, the embodiment of evil or incarnation of Ahriman on Earth, or the coming incarnation of Ahriman, because supposedly that hasn't happened yet. And so when people talk,
who's Ahriman?
So Ahriman was actually, I think, back into the Zoroastrian religion, sort of that evil spirit, sort of like the Lucifer in their teachings. So he uses that phrase, and I don't think a lot of people are aware of it, but it's like another form of evil, like just as Lucifer is. A lot of people or religions, I think, combine the two and make them one and the same, but he distinguishes them as two entities, beings. And basically, we have to think of ourselves as the Trinity, and we have that Christ being within us. And if you want to say that, and a lot of other people think of Christ consciousness in that enlightened state. Well, that you think of that as the Christ being or consciousness incarnate, that we potentially have that within us, but we also have these other forms that exist, like the Luciferic ideas that can kind of get implanted in our minds. And there's also Ahrimanic forces. And how you distinguish that is Luciferic is more of the spiritual way of looking at things. So, for instance, if you think of even looking at going to complete bliss or complete nirvana, in a way, if that's your main goal and that's your only focus and goal, is to always have basically euphoria all the time. It's like almost like being drugged all the time. That's like a Luciferic desire, at least Luciferic, what you call I guess,
principle.
Principle way of thinking. You still have to be grounded in a lot of ways. So that's one side of it. And then our Ahrimanic side is more of the materialism, the material side of things. Just thinking, okay, I'm an atheist, for instance. I don't believe in God or any spiritual realm whatsoever. I just believe in what I can see and touch, and that's it. And so I am my own God. I can create what I want. Just like, what do you think's happening with transhumanism and the idea of using artificial intelligence to then advance us as fast as possible without thinking of consequences, or genetic engineering and creating these hybrid whatever creatures that could be half human, half animal, and like things like that you have to have some ethics and morals behind it. Otherwise we can go off in a really bad direction. So that's like the Ahrimanic forces that we are now combating more than anything. So supposedly Lucifer did actually incarnate, and he incarnated in China thousands of years before Christ. And so that was one fact that happened within the eastern part of the globe. And then the Christ came. Supposedly Jesus Christ was Christ incarnate, and that was in Jerusalem, Middle East area. And so supposedly Ahriman is going to come to the world and incarnate in a physical form as well, and that's going to happen in the West. So that's the prophetic teaching, or that's what Rudolf Steiner was saying is likely to happen even within our lifetime. He was thinking just years after when he was teaching this 100 years ago.
And this was based on his getting into the Akashic records and what he was seeing there, right? Like kind of channeling stuff and having stuff come through. Yeah, exactly.
So that's really what we're starting to look at, what we might be dealing with in the future. And a lot of Christians say, oh yeah, this is Satan and the Antichrist coming back right now. And I think that ties into the same kind of idea of this Ahrimanic force and influence. And again, we all have the good and the bad within us. We have the Luciferic and Ahrimanic ideas and forms of human nature within us, as well as the Christ. So it's that balance. The Christ is the fulcrum and the balancing point between those other forces that we have to deal with. But as a culture, as a collective, this is something that could really be taking place. So we don't know who, you can only guess who that person might be. That could be that Ahrimanic force that takes the lead in a physical form. I have my ideas, it could be, I don't want to say, but you just imagine those that are taking technology to the extreme, and those that maybe even are warning us at the same time. This is what we could potentially be facing if we're not careful. But anyway, I think that's really that's really what I wanted to touch upon as far as that goes. And there's a lot more in anthroposophy that I think is relevant, and I find a lot of meaning out of it. But that's just my personal journey where I've gone from all the other books I've read. And it's so funny that I think it's interesting that I'd never heard of it before at all until
me neither. Yeah.
In the last couple of years. And now I really see how it correlates and ties into everything. Yeah.
Really interesting. Yeah. And anthroposophy, I'll have to look that one up too. I mean, and that's another thing, something we're presenting here that, people need to form their own opinions and see how that it sits with them and make their own decisions on that philosophy and what it means to them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In no way, again, we never try to say this is what you should believe. This is how you should think. Always think for yourself, always come to your own conclusions, but be willing to take in all different sets of data and data points to either validate the model that you have or to come up with a new one. And I think we all have to be doing that.
Yeah, certainly.